In terms of society and civil liberties, the effect of the war at home is significant. You had mass migrations of Americans all around the country, moving to places that had really never experienced significant population boom before, particularly the West Coast and areas of the Southeast. Shipbuilding towns like Mobile, Alabama, Shreveport, Louisiana, Newport News, Virginia, and also into California, the aviation industry, Boeing, headquartered out of Seattle, the Washington State area. You see Americans moving all over, not just to search for work, they're finding work, they're going where the jobs are. And this begins the true advent of the Sun Belt in many ways, will grow from here forward. Women in the workforce. 6 million women entered the workforce, and had it not been for women labor, we do not win the Second World War. The contributions of women and minorities were vital in terms of industrial contributions on the home front. The war was a watershed event for blacks and women. The civil rights movement and the women's movement of the 60s and 70s, their movements for equality, they began here. They really truly traced their roots to the Second World War and the outcomes of the Second World War in so many ways. Mexican Americans, for their part, also were allowed more opportunities in the United States. The Braceros program allowed for migrant workers and laborers from Mexico to come to the United States and essentially engage in the agricultural harvest that we could no longer sustain without enough population of our own. Not that all this met without some tension. The Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles of 1943 saw discrimination, nativism against the Mexican Americans who were seen as somewhat unwelcome as intruders. There were also race riots in Detroit in 1943 and Chicago as well against African Americans. So there are tensions in all these movements of people around the country, people working and being forced together in ways they weren't used to as the society was changing so much. The greatest black mark of the war for the United States on civil liberties would have been Executive Order 9066. Japanese Americans during this time period were seen on the West Coast as a threat. This is largely hysteria and has its roots in the long-standing, as we've seen in several of our review units so far, the long-standing prejudice towards Japanese Americans on the West Coast, in California, Washington, and Oregon State. And in these states then, because there were fears that sabotage would be done by Japanese or Americans, American citizens or American-born Japanese of Japanese descent, it was decided they had to be removed from the coast, relocated to internment camps. Executive Order 9066, FDR signs this into law, and this enables this to take place, these relocation centers. Some 80,000 of these people were Nisei, or native-born Americans, who were then locked up by their own country. Ultimately, in the case of Korematsu versus the U.S., this goes all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. In this decision, the court rules in favor of the government. And by the way, this is still good law. It's still in the books. The case was never overturned. The precedent exists that the state has the power, if necessary, to round up and detain American citizens should the state declare there to be a reason to do so. Now, only one small problem with all this: no evidence of sabotage ever existed. In fact, ultimately, the United States formally apologized in 1988 to the Japanese Americans for doing this and to their survivors of, or next of kin who existed. Payments, I believe, of some $50,000 were granted per individual to each survivor of the camps. The United States formally apologized for this. But the Supreme Court, that was the legislature, the Supreme Court has never reversed the decision. The decision never came to it to be reversed. So as such, the Korematsu decision still stands as good law, and the federal government is still clothed with these powers. In terms of African Americans, the war did provide this watershed event, as we discussed. The Congress of Racial Equality is originally a college campus group that extends beyond this to work for the so-called Double V campaign, the victory against fascism abroad, the victory against racism at home. And there are troubles with this change with the migration in the war period, but successfully Executive Order 8801 is lobbied for and pushed for by CORE and the International Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And what they push for is to eliminate discrimination in federal jobs of federal employment like defense contracting jobs. So for the duration of the war, and then we'll see beyond in some different aspects, the federal government did not discriminate on its pay, wages, or pay scales, nor did it permit contractors who were contracting for federal government programs like building tanks or planes or what have you. They could not discriminate in their hiring and pay scales either. So you see those advantages, even with the mixed bag of success with the race riots of 1943 in places like Detroit or Chicago. Now, when it comes to the Cold War and heading towards the fact that the Allies are going to win the Second World War, as we said to begin this unit, When the Allies, as it becomes more and more apparent they're going to win, the glue that holds them together, the necessity of survival that holds them together begins to fray in part, because they each have their own separate interests in many ways. In terms of dealing with the Holocaust, a black mark for the United States is that the United States government might have known of places like Auschwitz as early as 1942, but never did anything to try to stop them, to bomb the camps, to bomb the railroad centers leading to them. It's sort of a big black mark against the United States, definitely more so than the internment of Japanese Americans, which was other than the treatment of Native Americans, the biggest violation of civil liberties we've ever had. We did not relax our immigration policy throughout the war to Jews, largely because of anti-Semitism in the United States during this time. It's sort of a big lapse on our part. Now, at Yalta in 1945, the big three met, and Roosevelt is clearly ill at this point. He's only got a couple months to live. And historians and critics of the president have often said, historians who were critics of the president has said that Stalin was able to take advantage of him. But the realities were, whoever was going to have troops on the ground in certain areas of Europe were going to dictate the nature of what happened in those areas after the war. So the big three all come in wanting different things. The British want a place for France and Germany in the new European order. They want to curb the Soviets. The longer the war went on, the more Churchill saw that, yes, the Nazis must go away, but the Soviets are now going to be a new menace. They're not going to want to engage in a collaborative effort with the West. Roosevelt refused to believe this and refused to accept that as his base premise for much of his presidency. But they wanted to curb Soviet influence in Poland and protection. The British also wanted protection for the British Empire. Russia was interested in having reparations for Germany, wants punishment like we'd seen in 1918. After all, they've lost 20 million people and their economy's been devastated. They want possessions in Asia. They want to have influence in Poland and to keep Germany permanently weakened. The United States, not unlike what we'd seen in 1918, wants a very different set of things. We want free elections in Eastern Europe, a democratic Poland, and we want a united nations. The thing we did not do with the League in 1918, 1919, we now want in 1945, learning from history in some ways, trying to push for some key foreign policy goals that we see during this time. Goals like what? Lower tariffs around the world, the open door free trade policies, self-determination of peoples, which is an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist thing, expansion of the U.S. sphere of influence. Granted, this may be the new American age we were claiming to see at this point in time, and this United Nations organization. Vague agreements were reached at Yalta. In general, to sum it up, Germany is being divided. They agreed into 4 occupation zones. There were going to be free elections in Eastern Europe. This never took place, by the way. Soviets would enter the war against Japan just as soon as they could when the Germans had surrendered. They enter literally days before the Japanese surrender. We thought we were going to need them more because we were talking about a conventional invasion as opposed to the atomic bomb, which was going to end the war quicker. Soviets were going to get some islands in the Pacific that are off Japan, and this New World Peace Organization that had been started to be talked about at the San Francisco conference, the United Nations, is going to start moving towards its true footing. Yalta, in many ways, is going to mark the high point of the alliance. Everyone got a little bit of something. But the spirit of Yalta is not going to hold firm, nor the letter. Things that people promised on all sides just weren't going to happen. And there wasn't a lot of chemistry by the time you came to the Potsdam Conference. There, they agreed to tell the Japanese to surrender unconditionally, and they're going to hold war crimes trials for the Nazi leaders, but there's not a lot of chemistry among the leaders. Potsdam, by the time you get to Potsdam, Franklin Roosevelt is dead. Stalin exists. Harry Truman has been replaced by, Winston Churchill has been replaced through the parliamentary election process in England with a new government. Clement Attlee was the new Prime Minister of England. So you had 3 new leaders, 1 old leader and 2 new leaders, trying to get to know each other and trying to figure out how to work through and muddle through this new post-war world, and it didn't necessarily go too well. The atom bomb was tested, in fact, during the Potsdam Conference. At that point in time, President Truman knows he can negotiate from a position of strength. To sum it up, the United States in so many ways was going to emerge from World War II vastly stronger than it went in. This event was a generational event, a transformational event, and the transformations that come out of it will continue into the post-war era, both in domestic policy, as we leave depression behind, and in foreign policy, where the United States takes on new and unique, almost seemingly permanent roles on the international stage that would have been unthinkable to a George Washington, either that we should do it or that we'd ever have the strength to do it, if you look at him in his farewell address back in the 1790s. But with that being said, we'll move forward towards the last half of the 20th century as our lessons continue.